Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film as we look today at the air war in Europe and the fight against racism in America. Now, an important part of America's strategy during World War II, and most conflicts since, has been the heavy use of air power to bomb the enemy into submission. And World War II, a big part of this, was strategic bombing that aimed to destroy the enemy's ability to make war by hitting factories, transportation routes, military bases, and similar strategic targets more than attacking soldiers on the battlefield. Of course, for the bomber crews flying over Germany, this was very dangerous, at least for most of the war. Very few bomber crews survived the 25 combat missions that would allow them to return home. Late in the war, it became less risky. So that the Army Air Corps increased the number of missions a crew had to survive to go home. But early in the war, some bomber raids saw fewer than half the Allied bombers return home. And over the course of the war, about 8,000 bombers, about 80,000 crewmen were killed in the skies over Europe. Now, bombers had guns of their own, which looked so impressive that the first major bomber, the B-17, had been nicknamed the Flying Fortress when first built in 1935. But in reality, these bombers depended on fighter planes, officially called pursuit planes, for defense. But fighter pilots would often fly off to try to take down enemy fighter planes to win the title of ace by shooting down 5 enemies, rather than stick by the bombers they were supposed to be escorting. Eventually, one fighter group particularly distinguished themselves as bomber escorts, and another way too, those being the Tuskegee Airmen, who supposedly did not lose a single bomber they were escorting because they did stick close to their bombers, but even the highest estimate of their losses still gave them a loss rate less than half the average loss by other escort groups. And even if we don't quite believe the legend, they never lost a bomber at all. They lost far fewer than any other similar unit. But the participation of the Tuskegee Airmen in combat was controversial because they were black. Now, ever since the Civil War, black soldiers in the U.S. Army had served in separate units. Many of them, in turn, served in menial jobs rather than in combat. Most officers in the Army saw no reason to change this, and President Roosevelt didn't plan to challenge the tradition either, for fear of alienating Southern Democrats, upon whose votes the Democratic Party depended. Confident, for the most part, no Southerner would ever vote for the party of Lincoln, but why risk it by supporting civil rights? But the New Deal had helped many African Americans because by helping the unemployed in general, it certainly helped black people who had a much higher unemployment rate than the national average during the New Deal. Furthermore, Roosevelt had insisted that New Deal programs employ black and white workers equally, although once employed, they were not always treated equally. And so many black voters had moved away from the party of Lincoln, whom they had always voted when they could vote at all, but now asked what the Republicans had done for them in, say, the past 50 or 60 years. But the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People warned Roosevelt that if he wanted to keep those black voters in his New Deal coalition, he needed to make some progress on racial equality. Furthermore, his wife, Eleanor, also pushed him to fight racism. In America, civil rights activists promoted what they called the Double V campaign. Originally started by the black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, February 7, 1942, saying they wanted to fight for victory over tyranny overseas and for victory over discrimination at home, a double V. Therefore, the Army Air Corps agreed to train an all-black fighter squadron, and eventually trained more than one, and even a bomber squadron, although it never saw combat. They did this training at the Tuskegee Institute, an all-black school in Tuskegee, Alabama, that already had its own private airfield. And they had very high standards, requiring college degrees for their pilots, whereas white pilots only had to be high school graduates, although in those days the high school graduation rate was low enough that even being a high school graduate was a mark of some distinction. But for a black man to graduate from college typically showed quite a bit of talent, what the civil rights leader W.B. Du Bois marked out as the talented 10th. And eventually, the Tuskegee Airmen were sent to Europe, although for a long time they were not allowed to operate in areas where actual opposition in the air was expected, so they rarely got to engage the enemy. But finally, they were allowed to assist in the amphibious assault on the Italian coast in the invasion of Anzio, and served so well there in the late summer of 1943 that they were then allowed to serve as bomber escorts. One unit of black pilots who served as bomber escorts painted the noses and tails of their planes red, giving them the nickname the Red Tails, although personally I preferred the term the Lonely Eagles. But as bomber escorts, the Tuskegee Airmen, as mentioned, were very successful because they were careful to protect the bombers they were escorting rather than trying to chase down and kill as many enemy fighters as possible. One reason the Tuskegee Airmen were so careful to protect their bombers was they knew they were not just promoting their own reputation, but that of their race, knowing if they performed poorly, officers would not want black pilots serving in the Air Corps, and would use this as an excuse to shut down the entire program, as quite a few wanted to do. Many Air Corps officers disapproving of black pilots, although the bomber units that did have them as escorts really appreciated their services and sometimes even requested them specifically. And the story of the Tuskegee Airmen is told in the film Red Tails, released in 2012 after George Lucas funded it out of his own pocket with his Star Wars money, when major studios refused to support a movie entirely about black characters, fearing it would not make enough money, especially overseas. Red Tails mostly covers events from January of 1944 through March of 1945, although it does show some events both before and after that time. It is mostly set in Italy, although there are eventual flights over Germany too. The movie was partly filmed in Italy, also in the Czech Republic, Croatia, and England. All the scenes showing airplanes in flight were created through computer special effects. Unfortunately, all the major characters are fictional, which is too bad, as there were many interesting members of the Tuskegee Airmen who could easily have been portrayed. Although veterans of the Red Tails who've seen the movie claim they could easily recognize who some of the fictional characters were based on, even without being told. In the movie, Colonel A.J. Bullard commands the Red Tails. He is based, very definitely, on Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the actual commander of the Red Tails, although the depiction does not do him justice. When World War II began, he was one of only 2 black officers in the U.S. Army, the other being his father. But he was one of the first 5 black men to complete a flight training course and eventually rose to become the first African-American general in the United States Air Force. His colonel there, but by then he is a general in that uniform. And 2 other Tuskegee Airmen would eventually rise to become generals as well. Furthermore, the character that in the movie is based on him, Colonel Bullard, is depicted as managing the Red Tails from the ground, not leading them in combat. In reality, Colonel Davis was an accomplished pilot who did lead the Red Tails combat missions. Major Emanuel Stance is another fictional character and one of the leaders of the Red Tails, again also shown commanding from the ground, not in combat, but in fact all the actual officers took part in combat missions. All the pilots are known by nicknames, particularly for radio contact in battle. Again, all the ones depicted are fictional. Captain Martin Julian, one fighter pilot, is nicknamed Easy. Lieutenant Joe Little is nicknamed Lightning, as another fighter pilot. Lieutenant Ray Gannon, who arrives with the Red Tails very early in the film and struggles to be accepted by them. is simply known as Junior, although he would prefer the nickname Ray Gun.